Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, for this very, very touching introduction. And I am excited to see my new book up there, because I haven't actually seen it in real life. So it's nice to have an image of it, though I believe it is actually out and in the bookshops already. And I'm very grateful to you for pointing out the way that I return to things, rework things, and see them in different lights, because that's a very good introduction to this paper, which is in fact very much that. The paper, which is called Mark Lewis's Rear Projection, Molly Parker, Canada, 2004, Reflection on a Work of the Intermedial Picturesque, is actually drawing on a chapter in the After Images book, but a chapter that was very reconceived in the light of this conference, as I'll say a few things about it, that in a moment. So, as well as a very heartfelt thanks to Agnes, and I feel she did take a bit of a risk inviting me to come and give this keynote, because I'm not an art historian. I've enjoyed the speculation around the issues that are central to this conference, but I have to emphasize that speculation is rather the operative word. I also have to thank Mark Lewis, who's the main subject of my presentation today, who's a friend of many, many years standing, and we've actually even worked together from time to time, but he has been very helpful as I prepared my presentation for today, and he's provided me with the visual material that I'll be showing as I work through the paper with help from there. Now, I also just have to apologize in advance. I am actually on my feet, but I've been struggling with flu, cough, and cold, and I do hope that today I don't get so consumed with coughing as I was in my presentation yesterday. Unfortunately, it did mean that I had to take some time off this morning to try and recover, so that I'm here on my feet this afternoon, and I was really sorry to miss the beginning of the conference, but I hope to catch up tomorrow. Okay, so those are the main introductory points that I wanted to make, and my presentation is primarily around one particular aspect of Mark Lewis's installation work. That is his citation of cinematic rear projection as a key aesthetic device. Between 2004 and 2009, he made 4 rear projection pieces, and I'll concentrate on the first, the Molly Parker, a rear projection Molly Parker. I've written about his use of rear projection, as I said earlier, before, but the topic of this conference has given me a new way of thinking about the device itself and about Lewis's use of it, in terms of both a certain kind of picturesque that I'm slightly unsure about how I'm using, but also in the context of the intermedial, of which I am much more confident, and certainly the in-between, which I think is a kind of underlying theme of the conference, and which I'm going to try and draw attention to throughout my presentation. So, I'll come back to the in-between attributes of rear projection later in the paper, but first of all, as an introduction, I'd like to locate rear projection Molly Parker in the context of some of Lewis's earlier work, his Canadian background, and the intermedial nature of his first early installation pieces. Mark Lewis was born in Ontario, in Canada, in 1958, and he spent most of his childhood there. His family moved back to the UK when he was a teenager, and he studied photography at Central London Polytechnic with the British conceptual artist Victor Bergin. Although his early photographic work was very much within the spirit of British conceptualism, in the mid-90s, he began to work with the moving image and gallery installation, and the work from which he's now known really takes off from that mid-90s point. Now, to my mind, there's a coincidence here in the timing of Lewis's development, somewhere between a historical accident and technological change. It was, as we all know very well, the arrival of the digital, the technological change that enabled the moving image revolution to move into the gallery and to take place. But Lewis's early installation work was all shot on 35mm film, so a kind of conscious archaicism marked his early installation work. He used 4-minute 35mm reels of film, and it was no accident that he adopted this aesthetic strategy, the single shot of film, as 1995, when this turn in his work took place, was, as we all know, the centenary of cinema. 1995 necessarily turned cinephile attention back to the beginnings of cinema, and most particularly for Lewis, this was represented by the first exhibition of the Lumiere brothers' experiments that was exhibited in the Grand Café in Paris in 1895. So Lewis wrote about his admiration for these films, a kind of awestruck admiration for these early films that were, in those days, a 1-minute length, which corresponded to the 1-minute reel of 35mm film. So this integrity, this slice of interrupted time and space predates that moment when film was transformed by editing, and then to discover, henceforth, the destiny of storytelling, narration, and dramatization that would dominate its future. So this reference back to the Lumiere's first experiments highlights the way that Lewis, as I would try to suggest, thinks across media. It's an intermedial way of thought that has characterized really the whole of his moving image career. And this in the early phase between a cinema that referenced the Lumiere brothers and the move into digital gallery exhibition. But his Canadian works of the early 2000s locate his concern for landscape and the picturesque in quite another intermedial frame of reference. That is, the first school of Canadian painting, known as the Group of Seven, or the Algonquin School, that formed around 1919 and continued to work as a group until around 1933. The Group of Seven were composed of artists who were drawn to the landscape of Ontario, or rather aspired to create a Canadian-specific school of painting that would reflect the impact of this particular local manifestation of nature, kind of nature, capital letters or inverted commas, as you will. The group met working together in Toronto as draftsmen, but turned to the lakes, the trees, and the weather that characterized the Ontario landscape. And now I want to just show you a few examples of work by the group of seven. Tom Thompson, who actually prefigured the group of seven and died in mysterious circumstances before the group officially formed. But I'm going to show you too the jack pine. So there's a way, to my mind, that the group were, in their painting, documenting the impact that the landscape had on them. And in that sense, oh, there we are. Tom Thompson, the jack pine, which is one of his best-known works. And then this is Lauren Harris. Lauren Harris, who brought a more abstract feel to the landscape. So, in a sense, I feel that they were documenting the landscape rather than searching for a grander, sublime, or a beautiful. And there was something very straightforward about the way that they approached their Ontario surroundings. And I think that the group of seven paintings offer a kind of backdrop to the three Mark Lewis works that also feature the landscape of Ontario, its natural features, its weather. His first Canadian work is called Algonquin Park, September, and it was shot in 2001. So, driving back from the interior of Ontario to Toronto in September, he noticed a mist arising from a lake. And at a certain moment in an autumn morning, between 5:30 and 6, the water is warmer than the air, and very briefly, for half an hour, produces this particular natural phenomenon. Once he'd seen it, he had to wait for a year before he could go back and actually turn it into the film that he visualized. Could we look at So the film obviously has a kind of painterly composition, a painterly framing, references to landscape art, um, um, and then Lewis uses the actual mist as a painterly device in its own right. And the pure beauty of the natural phenomenon is compromised by the intrusion of the human element, which is almost a cliche. And in the image of the canoe, it's uncertain who the occupants of the canoe are, whether they might be First Nations people or if they might be, as it were, contemporary tourists. But the canoe is certainly part of the kind of cliche of the Algonquin Park culture. This led to Algonquin Park Early March, which was shot in 2002, a more complex work in which the cinema contributes much more fundamentally than in the previous piece that I just showed. It's structured around a zoom, which starts at its tightest point and then moves out to its fullest extent. And this is a landscape film when the camera's high angle flattens the perspective and the frame changes its configuration to keep the image central so that the drama is kept within this space, gradually revealing itself to the spectator. Now, I just want to show it, and then I'll say a few more things about it afterwards. So So, as you've all seen, and I'll just be kind of reiterating things that I hope you've all noticed, that the pure white of the surface of the lake, the snow-covered surface, is illegible at first, and suggesting, of course, quite anachronistically, in the age of moving image installation, the whiteness of the projection screen of the past. Only as a few trees emerge at the very bottom of the image is it possible to establish the gradual contours of the lake, and then very, very gradually the film's reference with that, the film's reference to the group of 7 paintings. But the intervention of film here is transformative. And also transformative is the gradual revelation of the little skating rink in the top corner. Lewis has written about the Canadian winter in these terms. There's an unquestionable thrill to the look of winter. Beautiful barren landscapes covered with snow and ice, stark colors becoming signs of life that jump out of an empty white ground. A strange staccato floods an image of winter, raising everything to the surface of the image as if they were irregularities on the surface of the world. To me, a painted winter scene from the 15th or early 16th century can sometimes seem to contain early signs of the cinematic movement to come. So full of life can it be with the suggestion of the unusual and unexpected movement and activities. Winter weather accomplishes magical transformations and suggests a vastly expanded realm of possibilities. So there's an initial whiteness, connotation of purity, suggesting an untouched canvas, an empty page waiting to be written, disrupted by the children playing ice hockey in the little homemade ice rink, smoothed out on the edge of the lake. The square space with the small figures darting to and fro is only the size of a postage stamp, the widest point of the zoom, but the children punctuate the contemplation of the landscape, just as the pure abstraction of the film's first phase is punctuated by the appearance of the actual topography of the lake scene. And again, this I feel is similar to the canoe in the previous piece. The pleasure of play disrupts the pleasure of the sublime, and these unexpected movement disrupts contemplation. The ice rink only stays on the screen for a moment before the piece ends, almost like a flash into the kind of childhood memory that Lewis later describes in his thoughts on the Canadian winter. Algonquin Park, early March 2002, suggests that memory and the sublime do not coexist. The inscription of the childhood seen onto the empty snow-covered landscape generates a chain of memories that insist on the landscape's history and its humanity, negating the very idea of pure wilderness. Now, thinking about this scene, I just wanted to add something which I think is quite important and which I want to come back to at the end, but I want to mention now, which is its complete impossibility. It's a phantasmagoric scene, although it's actually played out in real life. The lake was in the wilderness in the middle of Algonquin Park, nowhere where any child would have gone to skate. And it actually took the team about 2 days to make the skating rink itself. It was so cold, it was 30 degrees below, and the camera actually froze from time to time. So I see there's something really, as it were, extreme and absurd in this film. The combination of the very, very, very long time it takes for the zoom to reveal anything of the surrounding landscape around the lake, and the tiny flicker of moment in which we see the children skating on the artificial ice rink. But these two films prefigure rear projection Molly Parker, shot in 2004, also in Algonquin Park, and which references both these early works. But first, I've got to introduce rear projection as a device and its relevance to the concept of in-betweenness and the intermedial. So this is the next part of my paper. So we have to keep these Algonquin Park works kind of hanging in the background until I come back to the Molly Parker rear projection a little bit later on. Now, it was the temporal and spatial discordances inherent in rear projection that first caught Lewis's attention. In 2003, he wrote, "The two elements march to different beats." And I'm going to explain the process in a second. This is just to introduce it. He says, back projection, certainly early back projection, brings together so inefficiently two completely different types of film experience that we can hardly not notice their montage effect. We experience the two visual regimes as separate and unwoven, literally as collage. Therefore, that which is designed to make the transition scenes relatively seamless is, in fact, makes transition truly palpable. On the face of it, this is a paradoxical condition achieved against the putative intentions of the scene itself. So here I want to emphasize this kind of question of paradox. The paradoxical two visual regimes not only emphasize the in-between nature of the device as a technology, but also as an aesthetic of perceptual uncertainty. I'm going to show you a couple of examples in a moment, but I just want to give you a little bit of historical background first. Whether or not the process was truly palpable, in Lewis's words, in its heyday, rear projection was an essential part of the production processes of Hollywood or any other industrial studio system. It was adopted widely in response to the problems posed by the arrival of synchronized sound. How do you record audible dialogue on location while preserving star impact? So, a scene or sequence was split into two parts, separating location and setting from the performers and the stars. The narrative setting was shot during pre-production, then taken to a specialized studio, and the plate, or transparency as it was called, would be projected onto a translucent screen. Placed in front of it, the stars, carefully arranged and with limited mobility, could then be conveniently filmed in the studio and their dialogue recorded and their privileged close-ups preserved. Many directors despised rear projection, and you can all think of it, if you can just summon up those scenes in, say, kind of 1940s Hollywood movies, when perhaps Humphrey Bogart is driving a car, and you can see that he's going kind of like this, and the landscape is going along behind, outside the windows of the car, being, as it were, unwound, almost like in the early pre-cinematic panoramas. And often Hollywood directors felt that this was something imposed on them by lazy producers who couldn't be bothered to deal with the scene seriously. But Alfred Hitchcock reveled in it. In his essay for the catalogue Hitchcock and Art, Fatal Coincidences, Dominique Paini argues that Hitchcock used rear projection for its dreamlike qualities, the uncertainty that double filming brought to the cinema, and ultimately for its modernity. Paini says the effect creates a semblance of reality without erasing the illusory device that goes with it. In a comment on the dance sequence of Saboteur, Hitchcock, 1941, a sequence that's had a particular influence on Lewis, Paini points out that the different aspects of Hitchcock's use of rear projection come together in the interests of an overarching emotional effect, as he isolates his dancing couple from the surrounding action and spirits them away from the other characters. This cinematic sleight of hand lends the situation an air of enchantment. The scene is a perfect example of the dramatic, poetic, and visual power of Hitchcock's transparencies at this point in the 1940s. Now, what I wanted you to notice particularly there was that the way that the two stars, as they dance, have to stand still, have to dance within about 2 feet of space, so that they stay precisely posed in front of the moving rear projection behind them. And this is something, it's not relevant to my talk here, but this was a scene that Lewis has actually tried to reproduce, or has reproduced, in another skating scene that was shown at the Canadian Pavilion in Venice a couple of biennales ago. So we can think of Hitchcock's use of rear projection, particularly in trains, North by Northwest, The Lady Vanishes, anything. But his near obsession with rear projection went very much beyond convenience, as Paini has pointed out. And he continued to use it after it seemed antiquated to his technicians, his advisors, not to mention critics and audiences. For instance, when Marnie came out in 1963, critics specifically condemned its processed shots, most particularly one when Marnie is first shown riding on her horse. For Hitchcock, it was essential to combine close-up with action, and in a pre-production meeting, he said this: "Now we see her riding. Then we go to close-ups, which will mean plates and things for her close-ups, showing her enjoying it and her hair blowing. It's very important that we establish here one big close-up of the hair blowing as she is riding." Now, you probably all get the absurdity and the obviousness of the device in that scene, but you can also get the sense of Paini's argument of the dreamlike nature of it, with that sudden cut to Marnie's childhood home in the back street of Baltimore. So there's kind of a kind of dreamy transition here. The intensity and reality of the previous location scene, in which Marnie rides away from the camera, mutates into a repetitive gesture in the studio as the artificial landscape unwinds behind her. And her screen space has become strange and disorientating, and foregrounding emotion over credible action. This sense of in-betweenness, the confusion caused by the introduction of a location into the studio, is evoked by Dominique Paini as an aggregation of spaces. He describes rear projection's characteristic montage of time and space in terms of strata of scenery, in which nature may become portable, and the ultimate space results from an aggregate in which film studio and the actual location sequence filmed in the real world remain uneasily separate or in between, setting up a space of in-betweenness. Now, Lewis has argued more generally that this accumulation of dislocations between the studio and the plate points to a contradiction that lies at the heart of Hollywood cinema. In principle, rear projection folds one level of time, supposedly invisibly, into another, as the figures in the studio foreground supposedly fuse with the projected space behind them. But because of its inherent imperfections, the usually invisible mechanics and processes of film production introduce into that otherwise seamless coherence and even intrude into the spectator's consciousness. As this kind of, I hesitate to say it, but I'm going to risk it, almost Brechtian reference to the processes of production was with some exceptions, taboo within the strict conventions of Hollywood. For Lewis, rear projection introduced a touch of modernism into this bastion of mass culture. In its very clumsiness, the device embodied the complex contradiction through rear projection, even if accidentally and unconsciously the materiality of modernism found a way into the ultimate mass entertainment industry of modernity. Time and space doubled, layered, aggregated. So these kinds of So these were the kinds of considerations that Mark Lewis, interested Mark Lewis in rear projection. And in the first instance, sorry, I've lost my place. Oh, yes, sorry. His interest in rear projection, but his actual work with the device, the recycling of the now archaic rear projection technology, produces another layer of time. Once again, his rear projection installations are based on citation. As I said earlier, his citation of the Lumiere single-minute shots. A shift in context that resurrects its original industrial use while drawing attention to its aesthetic, intrinsically paradoxical qualities. So, beginning with a kind of intense cinephile interest in rear projection and going through hundreds of old movies, collecting instances and turning them into a kind of online scrapbook for himself, with a mixture of curiosity and pleasure, Lewis began to search for any still functioning rear projection studios because these scenes were always shot in a specially constructed studio. Finally, he found the Hansard studio in Hollywood that the Hansard family had operated successfully for nearly 3 generations. And it was there, for the sake in the first instance of precision and accuracy, that he made the portrait of Molly Parker that became rear projection Molly Parker. But the studio was rapidly going out of business, and Lewis, his imagination caught by the family anecdotes and the poignancy of this story of technological decline, returned to Hollywood in 2008 and made a documentary backstory, Hansard Rear Projection, which came out in 2009. And here, in a compressed, poignant form, the Hansard father and son give a first-hand account of a modern object's trajectory into the outmoded that so fascinated Walter Benjamin. A mechanism once incorporated into the everyday of its own historical moment falls into disuse and finally becomes archaic, but recycled obliquely back into history, it can acquire a new and unexpected interest and aesthetic significance. So, this sense of dislocated time produced by the revitalization of the archaic, furthermore conjures up the dislocation that's built into the rear projection mechanism itself. Molly Parker, the plate, which we'll see in a moment, had been shot in the Ontario countryside near Algonquin Park, where Lewis had already shot the 2 films that I showed you, and across the same 2 seasons. Actually, I think I'm just going to show it to you now and then discuss it further. Otherwise, I don't want to give too much away before you see it. I think it's interesting, though I don't think Mark Lewis was actually aware of this when he made this piece, that one of the lantern tricks in pre-cinema was the transformation of a summer scene to an autumn scene or a winter scene, or like daylight to night, or something like that. So that kind of transition has a place in an archaeology of cinema, even if coincidentally. And here, the the essential duality of rear projection, the folding of double time and space within a single image, is exaggerated by the background transformation, and Molly's dress suddenly seems discordant and emphasizes the discordance of the device when the scene turns into winter. Also, across his career, Lewis has very frequently returned to abandoned buildings, and here we have a disused roadside gas station and a cafe standing in the background, desolate, with this sign, Howling Wolf, still prominently displayed. But the abandoned buildings carry the idea of the disused and obsolete across from the technology to the content of the image itself, and vice versa. But furthermore, Molly, as you'll all have seen, is filmed with a complex camera movement that combines a track with a zoom, what's known as a trombone effect, further flattening and making strange her figure's relation to the background screen. At the moment when Molly is almost in close-up, the plate shifts from autumn to winter, and the camera repeats the effect in reverse, etc., etc. As Ellie During has pointed out, the combination of an optical tracking shot, a zoom in, and a kinetic tracking shot, a track out, leads to a variation in the focal length while keeping the framing unchanged. As a result, the entire space is affected by a strange distortion. The cinematic subject is eclipsed for a moment, since no natural point of view can respond to an event of this kind. It is as if the form of the shot presented itself in its truth, a pure movement of the mind. The power of fascination of the dolly zoom lies precisely in the fact that it superimposes, in a single gesture, two a priori contradictory movements, advancing and withdrawing, moving closer and moving further away, at the cost of squashing all depth of field. He continues, in all cases, the issue is indeed folding of one time into another, or refolding one time into another. In other words, inscribing simultaneously within the same image disjointed temporal perspectives or distinct temporal orders and timescales. So, in its combination of the two effects, rear projection and the trombone camera movement, the Molly Parker installation disrupts the traditional securities of cinematic visual convention, creating on various levels a modernist sense of distanciation. Rear projection already confounds point of view, denying either protagonist or spectator a coherent relation to the screen space, and also already folds one time into another. Talking of time, am I okay for time? Yes. Now, this is a slight digression, but I feel it's an important part of Lewis's thought in putting this piece together. The Molly Parker rear projection piece is a portrait of Molly Parker, who's a Canadian actress, who was quite well known at the time for acting in an American TV drama series called Deadwood. Does that mean anything to anyone here? Perhaps not. It does. over there, our American contingent at any rate. Yes. So anyway, Molly Parker was in that, and she was rather at the height of her fame, and she wanted to do something with Mark Lewis, and they put this portrait together. But in researching the idea of the portrait, he looked back to certain Renaissance portraits where he became fascinated by a similar relationship between figure and background. The places the privileged subject of the portrait, as it were, near to the camera, near to the front of the painting, in close-up, as it were, superimposed on a faraway landscape that stretches into the distance. So he drew particular attention to this topography in the catalogue for his 2006 exhibition at the Fact Centre in Liverpool, where the Molly Parker piece was first exhibited. And he included particular images in the catalogue: Jan van Eyck's The Virgin of the Chancellor Rollin, 1435 to 6, and various Memling portraits and others. Now, he sent me a couple of the Memling portraits, and I thought I'd just bring those up to evoke what the effect is. Oh, that's another one. He didn't tell me who this is. Some of you art historians might know. So here, again, you see the detachment of the central figure from its background in an arrangement that recalls the aggregated spaces of rear projection. And in Molly Parker, Lewis was referring particularly to the stratification of exterior space than the opposition between a flattened foreground occupied by the figure in the Renaissance portrait, situated in close-up, and the distant landscape background. I became quite interested at the time, but unfortunately he hasn't sent me any images that actually completely evoke this. But there's some very, very beautiful, particularly religious iconography with the Virgin and Child in close-up. There's a beautiful Bellini in the National Gallery in London called The Madonna of the Meadow, where there's a landscape stretching out in the background, and the Virgin and Child are literally, as it were, in close-up in the front of the picture. And it kind of reminded me of the way in which the rear projection device sanctifies the stars and gives them something of that kind of very special iconographic privilege that we can associate with that kind of Renaissance religious iconography. So a privileged position for the spectator's eroticized gaze, possible edification, and even adoration. Now, at the end of Backstory, that's the Hansard documentary, the father and son discuss the end of the rear projection era. And by that time, their studio had closed down and they were both out of work. Billy wasn't out of work, sorry. Billy is now employed by Sony simply as a projectionist, showing films, rushes, and so on to industry people who were once his clients in his own studio. Both of them vividly evoke the present uselessness of their one-time productive equipment. And Mr. Hansard Sr. says, I don't see a couple of years in the future. It'll be a couple of months before I take this stuff down to Catalina and use them as sea anchors. And Billy adds, they'll make a nice driving reef for the fishes. And obviously, they had been put out of business by the new special effects that were brought in by digital technology. So, as I said a moment ago, a theme running through his work is Lewis's attraction to things, buildings, objects that are marked by what we might call the history of human use. This is particularly the case with the disused and abandoned buildings that he often films, and these kinds of places recur across his work. But Lewis's use of rear projection revolves around the injection of a new life into an archaic device and resonates directly with Walter Benjamin's idea that a return to seemingly outdated objects might invest them with a new value and a new meaning. He puts it like this in his essay on surrealism. Breton was the first to perceive the revolutionary energies that appeared in the outmoded, in the first iron constructions, the first factory building, the first photos, the objects that have begun to be extinct, or a grand piano, dresses of 5 years ago, fashionable restaurants when the vogue has begun to ebb from them. And in his Arcades project, Benjamin looked back at the 19th century Paris and suggested that obsolescence brings with it a kind of utopian detachment from the use, a utopian detachment from use, which releases an outmoded building or technology for an altered aesthetic. So Lewis's installations reproduce this shift from use value to cultural value. Recycled within a new context, the original object becomes a point of reference back across time, but loses its original significance. To resurrect the paradoxes of a forgotten and widely despised technology is to project a parallel, non-teleological approach to history that zigzags and can leapfrog across time and make unexpected links between a then, in the case of the film industry, and then, a then in the case of the film industry, and a now, an artist that now quotes it. The act of quotation pays a tribute to the hidden, overlooked complexities of the original device, but also confuses the linear relationship between past and present. And here, I think, the whole question of the in-betweenness of rear projection really comes to the fore. So I've argued that rear projection brought with it a kind of estrangement effect, which Victor Szlofsky, in his original use of the term, understood as enforcing a disruptive pause in the continuum of whatever human habit was at play in the time. In the case of cinema, habit might be understood in terms of the spectator's absorption into the coherence and homogeneity of a fiction and its credibility. The artificiality and temporal and spatial uncertainty of rear projection always hovered uneasily within the temporal and spatial norms imposed by Hollywood convention. All too often, the absurdity inherent in the device risked exposing the mechanism's fragility, bringing it with it that uncanny sense of a modernism displaced that had wandered into the inappropriate setting of mass entertainment. However slight the estrangement effect might be, it's allowed Mark Lewis to celebrate a device widespread within the film industry of modernity as an unwitting parallel to its contemporary modernisms. That's to sum up the point that I made earlier. Now, I've dwelt on several themes in this presentation. This is the end. This is my last point. But I want to end with a question of emotion, the nostalgia that Lewis invents, consciously or unconsciously, I don't know. And in conversation with him, he always denies the obvious fact that he introduces old buildings, disused buildings, abandoned objects into his films. So that seems to me an unconscious denial of something which is actually really important in his work. But in this case, what I want to emphasize is the way that emotion is there in his Canadian works. The flicker of childhood memory, the intrusion of the human into Algonquin September and early March, distance the purity of the landscape and bring a touch of cliché which seems to have a relation to the obsolete rear projection device. And also, with it, a desire to bring a lost past back into a present through an archaic, outmoded aesthetic strategy, and thus confusing, making an in-between space between the present and the past, which is, like so much to do with time and temporality, impossible to pin down or describe. Yeah. Like childhood memory and nostalgia in a sense. That's all. Yeah. So do we...
We have time, yes.
Right.
Well, we are the masters of time, so as I said in the morning, there's no plane leaving with our dinner tonight, so hopefully everything will be there, even if we are a bit late. So we have to take advantage of the fact that you are here. So anybody who wants to ask any questions, this is the time. Feel free to raise your hand.
Thank you so much for that lovely talk and introducing us to these works by Mark Lewis. I hadn't known about them. I just wanted to I was so glad when you came at the end to the question of emotion, because I was really struck in the Molly Parker piece that the trombone effect seemed almost to be between a sort of smiling and crying, that there was a really strange liminal affect that came out in the sort of movement.
Yes, I hadn't thought of that. I think that's a very beautiful idea. Had you seen it before?
No.
Oh, I see. So you've just actually picked that up from this moment. I'm very impressed.
Well,
yeah.
it's so durational that you
Yes.
have to think about something. And I was
Yes.
noticing the weird dissonance between the rear projection
Yes.
movement and the movement on her.
Yeah.
But I was also very struck. I don't know if anybody else felt that. Okay. That's all. I thought it was.
Yes, that's wonderful observation.
Okay. Anybody else? Comment, question, remark?
I don't mind if nobody has anything to say to me. Yes.
Thanks for this great presentation and the paper and everything. I just want to, I'm really into the music, so in the scene that Molly Parker, what do you think about this sign, the Howling Wolf? I think it's the reference to the blues artist, yeah?
Yeah.
But what do you think about it? It's also, I think,
Yeah.
for me, it makes a kind of also emotional thing.
Yes, that's absolutely true. Yeah, it always has meant that for me too, because whenever I see it, I think of the blues singer. But I never know whether this remote gas station cafe in the outback of Ontario was actually making that reference. I think it must have.
I
And
felt
don't think Mark knows.
Also, it's my first time that's
Yes.
seeing the film. I felt like that, like Howling Wolf.
Yes.
Once upon a time, he was there, maybe in that gas station.
What a wonderful thought! That you mean he was traveling through Canada, and he might have stopped at that little cafe or to get gas, and then they called it after him. Oh, so now I've had two wonderful ideas that people have introduced, and I'll take that one, both of them, back to Mark, actually. I think he told me not so long ago that the place is disintegrated by now, and that the sign is no longer there, because it's obviously rather on its last legs, even when he filmed it in 2004. So after all this time, it's disappeared. But nice that he's filmed it and that we have it there on film with that wonderful legend that you've now attached to it. I'm going to try and research Howling Wolf's career and see if there's any chance that he actually did do a blues tour of Ontario.
I saw the Algonquin Park film March at the Forum Photography Museum in Amsterdam.
Oh, really? Yeah.
So it was within a setting of photography, which
Yes.
completely altered also the interpretation
Yes.
of watching this.
Yes.
Do you know, is he often testing the grounds between, say, 2D and 3D, between photography and cinema, between motion and stillness?
Yes, I think so. What did you think when you saw it in the photography context? Did you feel that that relationship between movement and stillness
We were
was really
surrounded by
important?
still photography.
Yes.
And when you're watching it, it was not clear, of course, at the beginning,
Yes.
if it was about
Yeah.
motion or not.
Yeah.
So it's only when you stay on that you gradually see that there is movement.
Yes, exactly. Yes. I find that a little bit difficult to answer because I've thought so much about stillness and movement myself. I don't know what to impose something that I've thought on Mark. But, I mean, in many ways, when he thinks intermedially, as I tried to point out at the beginning, he thinks very much in terms of painting. And the two pieces there's a very early piece of his called, gosh, how embarrassing, I've forgotten. Again, it's a derelict building. Oh, it's called North Circular. It's a derelict building on the North Circular Road in London, and it was an abandoned factory. And again, he did a very, very complex camera movement in which the camera was mounted on a lorry or a truck of some kind and tracks in as far as it can, and then it zooms. And again, there's some children playing in the disused building, and one of them spins a top, and the camera ends in close-up on the top, holding on it until the top falls down. And that's a direct quotation of one of his favourite paintings, which is the Chardin painting, do you know it, of the little boy with the top. And another one, which is again a work that I like very much, he did in the National Gallery in London, with a very, very complicated camera movement, where the camera is mounted on a kind of complex arm, and it moves through the space. It's rather like a monster, moving through the space, looking for something, looking for a prey, as it were, until it comes to rest on, I think it's an Averkamp painting, which is indeed of a snow-covered skating, of an ice skating scene in Holland in the 16th century. Yes. And so that again, and so references to paintings, well, like I was suggesting about the Molly Parker, in a sense, I wonder if he didn't kind of rather turn his back on photography, but he's gone back now to making very, very, very short little scenes that are almost like animated photographs. Just a few seconds of something that he's just spotted in the street, and he's now collected hundreds of them. So they're just like, and they kind of reference photography as well, because they're just something quite arbitrary in, you know, in the street or somewhere. They're not these incredibly complicated cinematic setups that he went into for such a long time with very complicated apparatus and movements. This is literally just little views of a few of 20 seconds and so on, shot with his digital, on his phone, I think, you know. So I think there's a return. I hadn't thought of that before, but I think this new phase of leaving behind the complicated apparatus and going back to the small views and the everyday life and what he happens to see and what happens to capture his imagination as he rides around London on his bike, is a return, in a sense, to his photography. But they're not in the conceptual way that his early photographic career was.
Thank you for your talk. It occurred to me that in the 18th century, the cult of ruins is so closely linked to the discourse on the picturesque.
Oh.
And it just occurs to me that Lewis's attraction to buildings no longer in use and decaying, and also his attraction to a technology which is decaying in a certain way.
Well, it is now obsolete.
Yeah, certainly. And the ambivalence of nostalgia or subversion, as it is sometimes difficult to judge. Well, you brought an example with the ice skating kids. That was an artificial moment created in extreme circumstances, right? And I wonder whether among the decaying buildings or scenes, he ever uses such moments of artifice, creating artificially ruins, as in the 18th century. That was also called artificial creation of ruins.
It's perfectly
whether
possible.
You saw any trace of that?
I think that's perfectly possible. I mean, I certainly think that there's, to my mind, there's an indexicality in the ruin, a trace of the past, which is preserved as the building decays, which has a resonance of, as it were, the cinematic now as a decayed object. And so that's a parallel which I would make myself. I'm just trying to think whether there are any good examples of... I can't think of anything offhand. But I'm sure there are. I'm sure. But I think he rather than for the actual ruin, he goes for the disused. I think that's right. So the buildings that have just, as it were, recently been abandoned, rather like in the Howling Wolf cafe. So it's not necessarily it's not necessarily buildings that have, as it were, the kind of romantic aura of the actual ruin. It's rather more the decay of the 20th century that he's particularly interested in. And this is something that I didn't really mean to bring up, because it's not really relevant. I really wanted to concentrate more on the Ontario landscape pieces, the Algonquin Park pieces, and put them in the context of the group of 7, the Ontario School. But he has another very strong fascination with another aspect of his childhood, which is the kind of modernist architecture that appeared in Toronto in the 1950s, with, now I'm not going to be able to remember the names of the very famous architects and very important architects who were building there. Anyway, they were. And for Lewis, this modernist architecture, and particularly the Nathan Phillips Centre in Toronto, which once again has a skating rink in it, where he actually went to skate as a child. That's, for him, has got a kind of aura of 1950s modernism, which he says gave you a sense that there was a modernist future. There was a future of progress and aspiration that you could actually hope for in the future, but for him now just seems like a ruin, a decay, as that aspiration towards progress decayed all around him as he grew up, or something like that, yes. So actually, I think his interest in modernist buildings has that aspect to it as well. Stephen.
I don't have really a question, but I'm just trying to articulate some thoughts about the use of framings. I don't know if Mark has told you something about this, because rear projections, they go hand in hand with a specific kind of framing as well. I mean, in contrast with, they're definitely different than other special effects practices used in classical Hollywood, such as Schuften effects or matte shots and whatever, because of course, rear projections, they only work in close shots or medium shots, because you can't show the feet of the actors, and that's also in the Molly Parker film the case. But the thing is that, the strange thing, I think, is that, or the peculiar thing is that here, when there is a frame in a frame, which usually thwarts a kind of immersive experience, now a frame in the frame usually makes the image more credible. In the sense, that's why so many rear projections are used in scenes in cars, windshields, windows, trains, airplanes, whatever, because there is this kind of credible recreation of a space in a space.
Yes. Now that fits in, sorry, Stephen.
No, go ahead.
That fits in very well with his interest, which I didn't actually mention a moment ago, and didn't come up in any of the examples of the Renaissance portraits that I showed. He was very interested in the way that a window or some kind of framing device was used to make the separation between the foreground space for the sanctified figure, and then you look through to the landscape space beyond. And I think that's particularly so, you would know in the Van Eyck Virgin of Roland, where there are lots of internal spaces going out into exterior spaces, which also themselves have demarcation. I think that works very, very well. And one of the shots that he particularly loves, which I suppose I do too, is, I don't know if you know Max Offerl's Letter from an Unknown Woman, where you have the wonderful scene in the Prater, in the where they sit in front of the traveling, and there's the man on the bicycle who's making it all go around, and you see the device in the end. But that's a kind of a special example which Mark values enormously, which kind of captures that sense of the importance of the window in the train and so on.
I feel like this might be too obvious, but I just want to confirm that his nostalgia for his cinephilia and his nostalgia for these kinds of unintentionally modernist effects also extends to the history of experimental film, because I was...
His what?
That this nostalgia extends to experimental film, the history of experimental film. I was really struck with the March film, that it starts like Nam June-paik's Zen for Film.
Yes.
And then it becomes like a sort of inverted wavelength.
I didn't know what he would make of that.
He's not interested in the history of experimental film, or
not especially, but I mean, again, the Canadian background would certainly mean that Michael Snow would mean a lot to him. But I don't think he is. His obsession is much more with Hollywood. Occasionally with European art cinema, also with old late silent cinema, but very particularly late silent cinema, where there was a lot of filming in the streets with reflections and play of glass and traffic and so on. I don't think the experimental cinema has influenced him in the way that, of course, it has me, and is very important to me. For him, it's much more the archaic of Hollywood, of the studio system, of what no longer exists but still has this feel of modernity.
My question concerns also the nostalgia, but it might be far too speculative, actually, because as far as I know, the etymology of the word is connected to homecoming. Is connected to homecoming.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
And I wonder if it might be related to the uncanny.
Yes.
Because in German it's unheimlich,
yes.
which is the anxiety about feeling familiar.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. That's a very interesting point. Yes, because nostalgia is actually that sense of longing for home when you're far away. Yeah, which affected soldiers in the 18th century or something as a kind of mass hysteria. Yeah. I wonder. I might have to ask the artist about that. Yeah. But I certainly think there is, I think there is a nostalgia. The extent to which, I think there is an uncanny as well. But I suppose I'm hesitating slightly because I've thought a lot about the uncanny, and I've never really brought it together with the things I've written about Mark Lewis. So I'm beginning to think to myself, why haven't I ever done this? Perhaps I should have. It's, again, another very interesting thought. But certainly I think the Molly scene with the trombone effect that you were mentioning and the abandoned buildings, I think there's a lot of uncanny in that. And I think in a sense the rear projection, that sudden sense that something's going on that you can't quite see or understand what it is, does have a strong element of the uncanny in it. But I've never really developed that myself, and I now see that there's a good line of argument, potential line of argument there. Yeah.
I also just want to ask about, I don't know, have you ever talked with him about the seasons? Because in the first two ones, for example, the first one, I think it was September, so it was like fall. The camera was not moving, the scene was moving. The second one, the winter, the camera was zooming out, but the scene was freezing, kind of like frozen. And the second one, the Molly Parker, when it becomes a winter again, that there was camera, the object was a little bit moving out, like a winter and fall, and like there's something about seasons.
Yes, that's a very interesting idea. Yes, I think that's a good observation. Yeah.